Welcome again to the class at the University of Kansas, the biography of a city, Lawrence. This is session 7 of this class, and this evening we will have two speakers, Elizabeth Schultz and Katie Armitage. I'd like to introduce to you Elizabeth Schultz, who will be talking about growing up black in Lawrence, Langston Hughes, Not Without Laughter. Elizabeth is particularly important to this class because she is the instigator of it. Really, she is the one who convinced me that I should try to develop a course like this for the humanities program. And so I just want to make sure that we all understand that this actually comes out of the humanities program. Professor Schultz is a professor of the English department. She has been at KU since 1967. She received a BA degree from Wellesley and her PhD from the University of Michigan. She is a Chancellor's Club teaching professor, winner of the Hope Award, and has been teaching African American literature at KU since 1969, developed the first course in African American literature at KU. She has written extensively on African American literature, and she's taught in Japan, Africa, China, and of course here in Lawrence. She has recently published a very beautiful book called Unpainted to the Last, Moby Dick and American Art. Welcome, Elizabeth Schultz. Beth.
Thank you very much, Dennis. I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to be here because, as Dennis indicated, it was a dream of mine for many, many years to have a course that would focus on the multi-dimensions of Lawrence, and indeed we have it. So this is one of those rare occasions when the dream is not deferred, the dream is realized, and you are it. I want to begin by referring to a contest which the Lawrence Journal World held in November of 1978, and that contest was to find an appropriate inscription for the cornerstone of the new City Hall. A 10-year-old East Indian American won that contest. Her name is Saroja Srinivasan, and the suggestion which she made for a verse to be inscribed on the cornerstone was a line from a poem called Youth by Langston Hughes. And that line, I hope, is inscribed not only on the cornerstone of the Lawrence City Hall, but is inscribed on the hearts of many people who live in Lawrence. We have tomorrow bright before us like a flame. Indeed, there was a vigil this past Sunday in front of the courthouse, a vigil expressing a concern with what seemed to be the escalation toward war with Iraq. And there was a banner several yards long which said, "We have tomorrow bright before us like a flame," on it, with a rainbow in one corner and Langston Hughes' name beneath that rainbow. I'm glad to say that Langston Hughes is indeed a household name throughout our city. And his name and his work, I think, are known to many of us and will continue to be known to many of us, as there are a number of ways in which I think Langston Hughes and his work have become institutionalized in Lawrence. Indeed, an article in today's Journal World, I was very surprised when I opened my paper this morning to find a story actually about some recently discovered books of poetry written by Hughes and inscribed on the flyleaf to Josephine Baker, the wonderful dancer and singer of the 20s. And in this article, Hughes's presence in Lawrence is spelled out, and I'm just going to quote from the article because it summarizes the many ways in which we do continue to honor, to memorialize Hughes in Lawrence. A plaque near the entrance of City Hall bears his famous quote, "We have the future bright before us like a flame." A bronze statue of Hughes stands in Watkins Community Museum of History. A Kansas University rotating chair is named in his honor. The Langston Hughes Visiting Professorship is currently being held by Professor Mary Emma Graham in the English department. To continue, his likeness is included in a mural created by students and painter Wayne Wildcat at Central Junior High School. And an annual creative writing contest carries his name. And the winners of that contest are usually announced on his birthday, February 1st, and that event just took place to considerable excitement. I may also say that there are plaques throughout the town indicating where Hughes went to school and where certain members of his family are buried. But I want now to personalize just for a minute before beginning a discussion of the novel. As Dennis indicated, I came to Lawrence and KU in 1967, and in the summer when I was in Ann Arbor finishing up my dissertation and preparing to take my job here, I was actually subscribing to the Journal World. I was looking at the advertisements, looking at real estate and thinking about where I might be living. And I noticed, and this must have been in June, I noticed in a certain issue of the Journal World, on the page where the classified ads begin, in other words, in the very back of the paper, a 1.5-inch notice saying that the well-known poet Langston Hughes had died. This is the summer of 1967. And I had, as an undergraduate myself, been very interested in Hughes's poetry, and I knew that he had spent his boyhood in Lawrence. And so I was, in making my own preparations to come to Lawrence, his boyhood home, I was really shocked to see that he only deserved an 1.5-inch notice at the very back of the paper. Now, this long article with a photograph of the woman who discovered these books occurred in the first section on the 7th page, and as we see, we have a very fine picture of her and rather a long story, including 4 columns. So one might ask, what happened between 1967 and 1978 when a line from one of his verses was inscribed on the cornerstone? In sum, what happened was the Black Power movement, the Black aesthetic movement, and people began to pay attention to Langston Hughes and his importance to a nation, to a culture. And I think as a result of the national attention that was given to Hughes, at last he began to be recognized in his hometown. The prophet, ignored for so long, at last was heeded. Now, this is not to say that Hughes did not come back to Lawrence from his departure from Lawrence. But he came back to the university and he did a reading, and there are actually recordings of Hughes doing a reading in our Kansas collection. But the city did not acknowledge his importance. And I would say that certainly, without any doubt, Langston Hughes is presently recognized as one of America's greatest literary artists. Langston Hughes published over 35 books in diverse genres: poetry, fiction, essays, children's books, drama, and translation. He also collaborated with another writer, another African-American writer, Arna Bontemps, on a book of photographs. Hughes, in another way, is also important for the diversity of modes in which he wrote. His writing was lyrical, polemical, satirical, and tragicomic. And that is really I intend to leave that sentence open-ended, because Hughes is diverse in his fundamental way of seeing. I think he envisioned a multicultural society long before that term, that concept, that word became so familiar to all of us. Langston Hughes has been the subject of several biographies, dissertations, and critical studies. Perhaps he is best known for that question that he asked in his great poem, Montage of a Dream Deferred, that question, what happens to a dream deferred, which we go on trying to answer. He probably is also best known, equally well known, for his essay written in 1926, the year before he began to write Not Without Laughter. And the title of that essay, of course, is The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain. And in some ways, that essay became a manifesto for African American writers during the Harlem Renaissance, the 1920s, but continued to be a manifesto for black writers in the 1960s, that period of the Black Power movement, the Black Aesthetic movement. I'm just going to read this because I think that this statement contextualizes the novel that we're going to discuss later. We younger Negro artists who create now intend to express our individual dark-skinned selves without fear or shame. If white people are pleased, we are glad. If they are not, it doesn't matter. We know we are beautiful and ugly too. The tom-tom cries and the tom-tom laughs. If colored people are pleased, we are glad. If they are not, their displeasure doesn't matter either. We build our temples for tomorrow, strong as we know how, and we stand on top of the mountain, free within ourselves. Langston Hughes had a vision. He had a vision for African Americans. He had a vision for all of America. He had a vision for himself as an individual writer. And I believe that that vision started in Lawrence. And I think that we can see that that vision is expressed to a very great extent in Not Without Laughter. Langston Hughes spent 7 years in Lawrence from 1909 to 1916. The novel, Not Without Laughter, covers a young black boy's coming of age between 1911 and 1918. Now, the years are a little different from the years that Hughes himself spent in Lawrence, but actually the time of growing up is the same. The novel, Not Without Laughter, was actually, as I indicated, started in 1927, and Hughes finished it in 1930. So he wrote it over a three-year period during which he was finishing his college education at Lincoln College in Pennsylvania, and during which he was also in touch with a number of very well-known politicians, students of the culture, and artists whom we associate with the Harlem Renaissance. Jessie Fawcett, Zora Neale Hurston, W.E.B. Du Bois, and certainly all of these African American writers had a direct impact upon Hughes's own writing. But he also, during this time, had the encouragement of a white woman, Mrs. R.O. Mason, who really financed him so that he could have time off to do his writing. And in some ways, her encouragement and her support was very nurturing for him. So it wasn't only the kind of inspiration that came from other African American writers, but it was the maternal influence of Mrs. Mason, which also helped him, in addition to the fact that she certainly helped him financially. Hughes's life in Lawrence was quite different from the life of Sandy, his protagonist in Not Without Laughter. And I want to spell out some of these differences so that you will get to know not only Langston Hughes and feel more comfortable with his biography, but also so you will you can begin to ask yourself why he changed Sandy's story in writing his novel from his own the facts of his own boyhood. I think the thing that needs to be emphasized above all about Hughes's boyhood in Lawrence is that he was a very lonely kid. He not only was isolated from his white playmates, but to a certain degree he was also isolated from the African American community. But his loneliness began at home. His mother was seldom at home. His father was never at home. And he was, for the most part, raised by his grandmother, his mother's mother, who was known to be a very severe, a very stern, albeit a very proud woman. Mary Langston was proud for a number of reasons. She was proud of her own abolitionist past. In addition, she was very proud of her first husband, who went with John Brown on the Harper's Ferry raid and was killed there. And she herself was honored for her being the widow of this follower of Brown, and she cherished all of Hughes's, through Hughes's boyhood. She cherished the shawl which was sent back to her from Harper's Ferry and had apparently a bullet hole in it and bloodstains on it, which were the talismans of that significant moment in the events leading up to the Civil War. Her second husband, who was Hughes's grandfather, really was equally distinguished. He was the brother of John Langston, who is actually mentioned in Not Without Laughter, who became a very distinguished African-American congressman. However, although Mary Langston was an exceedingly proud woman, and I think her pride and her sense of the contributions of African Americans to American history certainly must have had a tremendous impact upon Hughes, she was not a warm and necessarily a supportive person. She was very, very demanding of Hughes. And therefore, when Hughes, as a boy, had the opportunity to stay with another black family, the Reeds, who lived on New York Street, his grandmother lived on Alabama Street, he was very delighted to be able to do so. And it was at the Reeds' house where I think he felt that laughter and stories that weren't always heroic and were not always about the bravery of African Americans in the trials and tribulations leading up to the Civil War and during the Civil War. I think it was a much more comfortable place for him. It was through his connection with the Reeds that he was introduced really to the African American church and had what to him was a traumatizing experience of being baptized in the church. Let me also say that a number of the events that you find described in Not Without Laughter, suggesting the racism that existed during Hughes's boyhood, did indeed actually occur to him. The situation described in the chapter called Children's Day, in which the white children are allowed into the carnival, the black children are turned away, actually occurred. Likewise, Hughes, in going to elementary school, found himself and his black friends put at the back of the room, not placed according to the alphabet, but separated out. Let me say that I think it's important to note that Kansas schools, at the time that Hughes was in school, were segregated and integrated. They were segregated up through the 5th grade. In the 5th grade, students were, black students and white students were integrated. So there really was this kind of double system, whereby on the one hand, I think Kansas reflected a Southern mentality in keeping black students and white students separate at school, but then when the children got older, a Northern mentality seemed to be put into place. And when the Brown versus the Board of Education law was passed, which demanded integration of all schools, Kansas was being asked to integrate primarily its elementary schools. I think it's also important to point out that at the time that Hughes was growing up, social institutions were also separated. Churches were separated. Black churches were separate from white churches. The YMCA was strictly a white institution, and a great number of other social institutions were not open to African Americans. These, of course, were the days when African Americans were forced to sit in the peanut gallery at the Opera House or the movie theater, or they were forced to sit not at the back of the bus in Kansas, but they were forced to sit at the back of the movie theater. And we know what an impact that had upon Harriet in Not Without Laughter. Just let me point out that prior to 1927, the date when Hughes began writing Not Without Laughter, he traveled through the South, and it was while he was in the South that he began to experience the richness of African American culture, music, dance, stories, and he enjoyed fully being a part of that very, very rich culture. I think probably from his growing up in Lawrence, all of his life, he took an enormous amount of pleasure in African American idioms, in African American language uses, and certainly in his travels to the South just before he began writing the novel, he was in that linguistic honeypot in the South. That journey to the South, in addition to his developing a relationship with this white patron, Mrs. Mason, I think had an impact upon the novel that Hughes was began to write, and really helped him to shape the fictional family that Sandy is a part of in the novel, and which really looks so very, very different from his own family. And the boy, therefore, that Sandy is, seems to be such a different boy in some ways from the boy, the very lonely boy that Langston Hughes was when he was growing up. Now, I had Dennis pass out some study questions for you in class last week, and I'm going to ask you to think about some of these questions that I passed out with me to try to think about the novel and how it does indeed represent Langston Hughes's vision, not only of a young black boy's coming of age in a small Midwestern town, but Langston Hughes's vision really for an African American culture as well as for American culture at large. In Chapter 1, we have what I really think has become a kind of trope for novels that are set in Kansas. We have the appearance of a cyclone. And obviously, everybody knows that Frank Baum's Wizard of Oz, which was written 30 years prior to Not Without Laughter in 1900, also begins with a tornado, which has a dramatic impact upon young Dorothy, whisking her away from Kansas to the magical land of Oz. And I might also point out that 30 years after Hughes's novel, Gordon Parks is to write, and Gordon Parks is another well-known African-American novelist, autobiographer and photographer. He wrote The Learning Tree in 1963, which some of you may know, and can you believe it? It also begins with a tornado. Certainly it might be possible to say that Langston Hughes is making a reference to The Wizard of Oz, but one could say that the land of Oz is not revealed to young Sandy after the tornado or after the cyclone passes through the small town of Stanton. One could say that what is revealed is reality. So I think one wants to think about why he begins this novel with the cyclone. I'm interested in knowing if any of you have any thoughts about that. What does the cyclone, how does the cyclone set things up for the novel? Anybody have a thought? Yeah. I have to ask, is the TV being turned on our student answers? Okay, good. It levels the playing field, so it doesn't matter who is black or white. Okay, and anybody expand upon that just a little bit? Because I think that's an excellent way to begin. Yes?
Well, that's that too, that his aunt is taking care of the people who are dead or trying to help the sick, and they're really, the white people are appreciative of her.
Yes, they are. She is known as, whenever anyone is sick or in need, Aunt Hagar goes to attend them. And obviously, what happens as a result of this cyclone is that an elderly white man and woman are killed. One is thinking about Florida right now, even as we're talking. And their niece is hysterical. Aunt Hagar thus goes to comfort them. So I think there are a couple of things revealed here. One is, indeed, the playing field is leveled. I think what is suggested is that this natural force is an equalizer. The natural force doesn't recognize race. Likewise, it doesn't recognize who is good or who is bad. The natural force is amoral. It doesn't make judgments. What it demonstrates is the common vulnerability of all people. What it also demonstrates is that if, as human beings, we have anything in common, it is probably our mortality. And I think Hughes wants to begin his novel with the sense that at some point in human lives, we are equal. We are all finite, powerless in the wake of this tremendous natural force. And he, I think, does indeed suggest that from the outset of his novel, that in some sense, we do all begin on the same playing field, to use your metaphor. I think we become, in that first chapter and in the second chapter, we begin to become aware of the African American community. But we also, from that opening chapter, we are made aware, I think, of the fact that if the African American community gathers together to talk about the tornado, there's a considerable amount of interaction with the European American community as well. And as you were saying, Aunt Hager is called in to help the niece of these elderly white people who is and her husband who are traumatized by the event of the tornado. And I want to therefore ask you, because I think this is a crucial question. The novel takes place in a small town. This is Lawrence, although the town is called Stanton. But I'm wondering, as you read the novel and as you thought about it, what seems to you particularly Midwestern about this town? What is there that impresses you, that makes you aware of the fact that this is not a large metropolis, this is not a big city, but that this is a city, and that this is not a city that is in North Dakota, nor is it in Alabama. It is a city that is Midwestern. It's between North and South. It's between East and West. What is it that makes it specifically Midwestern? Anybody want to respond to that? Yes.
I just think it's because of how you get, when you read the book, you get a sense that everybody knows everybody else within the community. And also, you don't really...
That's a good point.
And it's not, the town, you get a sense it's not in the northern part of the United States because there is quite a mixture of both African Americans and whites within the community.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, for example, you look at the character of Aunt Tempe and how she's moved over to where most of the white people live and has progressed in that form. And you don't get the sense that you're in the Deep South either, because a person like Aunt Tempe would have never acquired the economic status in the Deep South as they had in Not Without Laughter.
These are excellent points. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Also, I mean, aside from the cyclone, I think just the cycling of the seasons and the effect they have on people, you get the whole range from people saying, oh, it's such a horridly hot day, all the way into the freezing winters. Just the extremity of invariance between the weather is exclusively Midwest.
And you're aware constantly, are you not, of the fact that there are garden plots that are right outside these houses. And indeed, Sis Johnson is peddling her own vegetables. And you know, therefore, that this agricultural dimension of the lives of these people is very close to them. And thus the weather is very close to them. And they're always conscious of hot and cold, rain and sun. There are a great number of references throughout the novel to lawns and flower beds, the morning glories closing or opening, the apple tree in bloom or not in bloom. So there is the sense that the land itself is very important to the people in this town, and not only the land, but the weather. I think your point is very well taken. Likewise, I think the first point that was made is very important. There's a sense that there is not a line drawn by a railroad track with white people living on one side of the railroad track and black people living on the other side of the railroad track, or of blacks living on one side of the street and whites living on the other side of the street. Across the street from Sandy is a white family in a very large house. But you also have the sense that, as you were describing, that Tempe is living in a neighborhood where there are a great number of middle class, perhaps upper middle class whites. So the housing does not seem to be as segregated as it might have been in a northern city, and probably actually wasn't in the South, where blacks lived on one side of the alley and whites lived on the other. So there is a kind of this Midwestern town of Stanton is neither north nor south. There seems to be a kind of a fluctuation as to where people live. Now, I think with the exception of Tempe and some of the other African American professionals, we have the sense that most of the people whom Sandy plays with, most of the kids whom Sandy plays with, live in small houses. And there certainly seems to be a class division if there isn't a race division. It also seems that the Bottoms are, well, let me ask you, what kind of a place is the Bottoms? Anybody want to comment on the Bottoms? Yeah.
Well, it's the worst place in the town. It's where
according to Aunt Hager.
According to Aunt Hager.
Right.
Or
according to Harriet.
It's the best place in
Yeah.
town. It's the most fun, where all the action is. But
Yeah.
it's where all the illegal activities are going on as well.
But what else about it? Is it segregated?
No, not at
It's the
all.
one, and indeed Hughes comes right out and says that this is the one place in town that is not segregated. And it's likewise because this is where the bootlegging goes on, this is where dance, music, gambling, and the whites are there as well as the blacks. And certainly, whereas Aunt Hager, for her strong Christian reasons, believes that the Bottoms are off base, and she certainly does everything she can to keep her beloved youngest daughter from hanging out in the Bottoms. Interestingly enough, Harriet is attracted to the Bottoms, I think, not only because of the action, but possibly that's the one place where white people act decently. It also is, she as a prostitute can turn her tricks there most effectively, no doubt, as well. It's been said of the small Midwestern town, and I think that in a way these statements characterize Stanton. It's been said that they have, and I quote, a profound sense of in-betweenness. They manifest, quote, an uneasy tolerance. And I think that this is what we find in reading Not Without Laughter, that Stanton seems unstable, unsettled, and there is the sense of uneasiness, this sense of fluctuation that really does characterize racial relations, possibly class relations as well. But lines do not seem as firmly drawn. And where on the one hand that might allow for growth, on the other hand that might cause a great deal of psychological anxiety, particularly for a young boy coming of age. Which leads me really to my next question for you, and that is, how are the races represented in Not Without Laughter? And let me just begin by asking, how do you think that African Americans are represented in this novel? What were you surprised in any way, for example, by the way in which Hughes delineates or describes black Americans? Yeah.
Well, I think what he does with blacks and whites both is there's no stereotype. There's no one way black people are, there's no one way white people are. There are so many different attitudes expressed on the part of the African American characters as far as their opinion about white people. And then there are all of the African American characters. You've got everyone from Aunt Hager and Angie, who work as domestics, Harriet, who is a prostitute, Tempe, who has moved up into the upper class, so to speak, and a lot of other people too. But there's just a lot of diversity within both communities.
There's, I think what you're pointing out that is very important is that there is a tremendous diversity in terms of the occupation that African Americans have. And I think that's very, very true. Likewise, you could say that there's a great deal of diversity in terms of their response to Christianity or their response to the blues. But I'm really thinking of the way in which race is represented. Anybody, are you with me on this question? Yes, sir.
Well, I was really surprised with, though, sort of in a sense of pride that he would describe their dialect or the way they would converse, African Americans. The fact that he would try to linguistically or phonetically match the way they would speak, even though grammar was butchered, everything. I mean, I found it very frustrating for a while trying to read it. And I found it very respectable that he was trying to match that as sort of as their culture, their heritage, a sort of a southern bringing in a linguistic manner, that this is the way they speak. But I found it fascinating that he was writing this at a time where he might possibly even try to not sort of pigeonhole them or cornerhole them into the race or the culture of African Americans as such a sort of a brutalization of grammar. I thought by putting it in that way that he might be kind of dumbing the culture or something like that, even though he was trying to, I think, sort of match it in a linguistic sense and trying to, you know, I know he was very proud of the sort of speak or linguistics of the Southern African American.
I think that, and there's...
But I was very amazed that he went ahead and did it. And
there's, I think, a good deal of evidence that he really associates it with poetry.
Mm-hmm.
And that when we have Tempe correcting Sandy's English, the way in which she corrects him makes English sound rigid and stiff and without the kind of music and image that so characterizes the speech of Sister Johnson or Aunt Hager, for example. Yeah.
I just was going to reemphasize that when you talk about how did he change, what's different about this than might have possibly been different from his childhood. Not that we have any evidence of how people spoke here in Lawrence and how the people he grew up with spoke, but it might be interesting that was an influence. It might have been that it was more of an influence of having been in the South and having been sort of reintroduced to the African American community, that he wanted to emphasize the sort of beauty of that language, which is devalued.
Yeah. I think that's a very, very good point. Yes, sir.
I've read some South African literature, but the thing that struck me about this book was kind of like in Malcolm X's autobiography, just the variants, descriptors he used on different colors of black people. Mm-hmm. As far as, you know, he ran their own from like clay to, you know, an African black person versus, you know, well, Sandy. You know, I'd never really seen that much variance amongst describing different skin colors of black people in one book before.
Yeah, I was hoping somebody would mention this, because I think that, let me just read a passage to you. This is from the chapter called Dance, and the description of African American skin color in this chapter is simply stunning. It is an entire palette represented here, and this is just one example. Dresses and suits of all shades and color, and a vast confusion of bushy heads on swaying bodies, faces gleaming like circus balloons, lemon yellow, coal black, powder gray, ebony black, blue black faces, chocolate, brown, orange, tan, creamy gold faces, the room full of floating balloon faces. That's just a single sentence that conveys this fabulous range of color possibilities. Did you all not notice this? Because I really think it is a factor that if you were to read a contemporary African American novel, you wouldn't necessarily find this luxuriating in the diversity of African American colors. Now, my question really, and it's, I think, related to the way in which Hughes represents race in the novel, And believe me, you could go through the novel and point to a great number of passages which show this wide range. Why do you think that Hughes does describe African Americans as they're not all black people? They are chocolate, creamy, ivory,
Simply put.
coal black, blue black, luscious colors. Yes, sir.
I think simply put, for that reason, not to describe them as simply black people. I think he wanted to give them a sense of individuality, the idea that each person is to each their own and different in different ways, that, and not even just in that sense. I mean, I'm sure that there is some sort of, there could be a psychological even placement to that, by if you're this color skin, maybe somebody will treat you a little differently than this way. And I mean, that's my own little theory thrown in that, but I mean, I think that's why you want to do it, is to represent the black community or the African
What else do you
American
think he might
community.
be up to? What else do you think he might be up to? Yeah,
He might be trying to portray how beautiful the black race is, because a lot of people
absolutely. I think there's no question about that.
have a lot of people think the way that people thought back then, as you mentioned the word black, and everyone associate with ugly, harsh,
Absolutely.
being very negative, and he's trying to portray how beautiful they can be and the different varieties that they are.
Good. What else is he trying to do? I think these are excellent observations. Yes,
I think
great.
there was some sense of hierarchy among the colors within the black community itself. Yowlers seem to be looked down on somewhat, that sort of thing.
If you're black, get back. If you're yellow, you're mellow. If you're white, you're all right. I mean, that's an old, hideous, racist verse. And I think he's trying emphatically to deconstruct that. I think he is attempting to, at this, in 1930, I think through his representation of this fabulously beautiful, gorgeous, luscious panoply of colors, I think he is attempting really to suggest the dangers and the immorality of attempting to classify by color. And this goes back really to the initial comment that was made about the differences amongst people, beginning with this racial difference. And then on top of that is certainly different jobs, different personalities, and though in some ways it perhaps can be said that Hughes does perpetuate certain gender stereotypes, I think he is bent on completely destabilizing racial stereotypes. What about the way in which he represents whites? Harriet says, I hate whites, I hate whites, I hate whites. Certainly we have story after story which reveals the way in which white people destroyed African American lives, not only during slavery, but during Reconstruction. We have the story by Sis Johnson regarding the greed and the jealousy of a white community when the black community, the small black community in another town began to become independent, began to become prosperous, and they were driven out by fire and beatings. And we have all of the episodes in which Sandy experiences prejudice on Children's Day, prejudice at school, prejudice when he is at work, at the hotel. It would seem that Hughes is representing white people as a nameless force of evil. They are unjust, they are brutal. Is this a fair assessment? Somebody please disagree with me. Yes.
Hagar doesn't. She's about the only one. It's like there's no room in your heart for hate. She
No
always
room in
says
your heart for hate, it rusts your heart.
Yeah.
Should have nothing but love.
Yeah.
And we know, of course, that Hagar, as somebody commented earlier in the session, it is Hagar who goes immediately to help these white folks when the cyclone strikes. What else? Does Sandy hate whites? Does Sandy grow up hating whites, even though there are these examples in which he is really humiliated by his experiences at school? Yeah.
Not entirely. I don't think he does entirely. I think he has some good relationships with some white. He has both, though. He's not. He's upset by the his mother's white boss,
Mrs.
the
Rice.
woman, right,
Yeah.
who is pretty not nice to her.
Imperious.
She, yeah.
Person who really does degrade and debase Angie,
Right.
who
But-
works so hard for her.
Right.
Yeah.
But then he gets along well with the. He has teachers that he likes,
Uh-huh.
and then there's the guy who owns the print shop
Mr.
where he works
Prentice,
after he moves
yeah,
in
the
with
bookstore.
Tempe. He gets along well with him and his daughter, who
yeah.
gives him books to read.
Right. And so he realizes that there are some white people who are not mean.
Mm-hmm.
So when Sandy can, even though certainly he personalizes his anger toward whites when he thinks about Mrs. Rice and how she really degrades his hard-working, patient mother. He knows other individual whites who were kind to him, even though he also says that Mr. Prentice would never give him a job as a clerk. He'd always have to be sort of the shop boy and be the person delegated to sweep up the store. But I think that Sandy, unlike Harriet, can see whites as individuals and thus move away from sort of categorizing them. Or certainly Sis Johnson does the same thing, and I think with very good reason. They have been repeatedly oppressed by white cruelty. But Sandy is, not only is he influenced by his grandmother, who has a different story from slavery to tell than Sis Johnson does, about her love for her young white mistress, but he also has had these different experiences with whites as well. I also point out to you that this is a story in which Hughes recognizes that there are some black people who pass. And the character of Buster in the story, I think, is very important, because it is Buster who literally busts through that color line. And Hughes is very conscious, therefore, of the arbitrary nature of racial patterns. Let me go on to look at perhaps the larger question then, and that is, how does Hughes present the African American community? Does he idealize it, or does he suggest that there are tensions within the community? I think that certainly he does suggest that there are tensions, and it seems to me that those tensions are largely manifested through class. It is when Tempe decides that she wants to become a property owner, and when she decides that she wants to model herself on her white employer, that Tempe really then distances herself from the African American community. What is ironic, of course, is that Tempe also becomes an advocate of W.E.B. Du Bois, who on the one hand certainly encourages the idea of the talented 10th, but also was a force for black pride in the 1920s. What Hughes does, however, idealize is the African American culture of song, music, dance, and story. And although music, dance, and song are associated with the blues to such an extent, and I think that Hughes, who in 1926, just before beginning to write this novel, published his first book of poems, which is called The Weary Blues, was a great advocate of the blues. he also admires spirituals as well as the blues. And I think that it is in African American music that he saw the means for reconciling the kind of anguish, the tensions, the anxieties that he knew were part and parcel of African American life. It was in the blues that it would be possible, on the one hand, to acknowledge the tragedy of life, but it would also be possible to see in it laughter and beauty. I think of one line. There are many passages from the blues that are quoted in the course of the novel, but there's one that I think is particularly pertinent, and that is, "My bed is hard, but I'm laying in it just the same." And when the music of the blues gets to when the rhythm and the beat of the blues pulsates, as Hughes tells us in that crucial chapter called Dance, loneliness is pounded out of life. Let me also say that blues lyrics in general are usually about loneliness, about alienation, about unrequited love, but the music, if the words are sad, the music is jubilant. The music is joyous. The music suggests the beat. And what Sandy says, and I think Sandy's perhaps most important words are, "I want to live." And when he actually leaves Stanton at the end of the novel and moves to Chicago, he takes with him his memories of that small town. He takes with him a sense of the importance of all of the members of his family, each one of whom represented a different point of view, but above all, he takes with him a knowledge of the blues, of the spirituals, of the stories, both about love and hatred. And it is with these diverse possibilities for expression that he creates his own life, that he creates his own dream, that he creates a new, a sense of self that is based on the past.
Welcome back to the second half of our presentation on Langston Hughes. Katie Armitage is back with us again for a second presentation. However, I'd like to introduce her again to the audience in case you don't know her. Katie Armitage is a long-time historian, local historian, and state historian in Kansas, working on these topics for at least 20 years. She's a frequent lecturer of the Kansas Humanities Council Speakers Bureau, as well as the Missouri Humanities Speakers Bureau. Is a frequent tour leader in Lawrence, on Lawrence Parks and Recreation. She leads tours on the Underground Railroad in Kansas, the Oregon and California and Santa Fe trails, retracing Quantrill's raids. A strong historic preservationist, has worked for a number of years, particularly in the Lawrence Historic Resources Commission, currently serving on the Hobbs Park Committee to save an 1860 house from demolition, and gave a lecture earlier on survivals of Quantrill's raid, 1863, widows, orphans, and others. She is a scholar, continues to publish a number of articles in Kansas history, worked with a number of compilers on a book called On the Hill, A Photographic History of the University of Kansas, and co-authored a book with John Lee on 19th century houses of Lawrence, Kansas. She comes to us as a native Texan with a Bachelor of Arts degree from Baylor, but received also a Master of Arts degree in history from the University of Kansas, has received a number of significant awards for all of her fine work. Welcome back, Katie. Thank you for coming again.
Thank you, and good evening again. My charge tonight is to bring the Lawrence of Langston Hughes' boyhood to you, and I'll be using a number of slides to do that in just a few minutes. I think a little word of explanation as to how I got into this may be in order, because I'm not a specialist in African American history, or certainly not in literature. But I was introduced to Langston Hughes by my husband, actually. May I have the cover of the Langston Hughes Reader? My husband is a biologist who has taught here at the University of Kansas for many years, and he had an interest in Langston Hughes and had acquired this book, and you see it's a little tattered now, but he's had that since 1958, and it's a wonderful sampling of Langston Hughes's work. And I had become acquainted with it. And like Beth Schultz mentioned in the earlier lecture, I too had been very concerned that children, my own children growing up here in Lawrence, and the Lawrence schools that I worked with a great deal, that very little was being done to educate people about Langston Hughes. So in 1975, I did a little poetry project. Langston wrote some marvelous poems for children, and I had the children, third graders, all across the Lawrence community illustrating some of his poems for children. Then in 1977, I went to work at the Watkins Museum on the Lawrence History Project. And it was while I was working there that Professor Bill Tuttle, whom you'll be hearing from later, and heard from Catherine Tuttle, I believe, last week. Professor Tuttle was at a meeting, one of the national meetings, and he happened to meet Professor Arnold Rampersad, who had just been given the assignment of writing the biography of Langston Hughes. And so Bill Tuttle said to Arnold Rampersad, "You must come to Lawrence, Kansas," because that's where Hughes grew up. So I really credit Bill Tuttle for introducing me to Arnold Rampersad. And may I have the cover of Arnold Rampersad's wonderful biography. And Arnold did come to Lawrence 3 times, and he found here, I think, as he had expressed it, that you couldn't understand Langston Hughes without understanding his Kansas roots. And I had the privilege of working with him on the Kansas chapter, certainly not anymore. But that's when I delved more deeply into the Lawrence of Langston Hughes's boyhood. And could we have the photograph of Arnold Rampersad? Arnold Rampersad, like Hughes, has a number of different racial and ethnic strains in his background, and seems to me the most appropriate biographer. His two-volume work, I just brought one tonight, is considered, I believe, one of the very best biographies of any African American. So that's how I got into it. And then the slideshow I'm going to share with you, I prepared for the Black Heartland Conference 1992, and that was Gerald Early's wonderful conference down in St. Louis. So with that introduction, let's move to the slides. First one, please. Well, on your monitor or on your television at home, you will see a group of men. And right in the middle, holding an extremely large hat, is Charles Langston, the grandfather of Langston Hughes. And he is shown here with a group of Oberlin, Ohio rescuers. In Ohio, Charles Langston had been active in the Underground Railroad, and this is a group, I believe, that were associated with that. It was at Oberlin College that Charles, or C.H. Langston, met Mary Patterson Leary, and Mary Patterson had gone to Oberlin, one of the very early African-American students there. And her first husband, as I believe Beth mentioned in her lecture, had been killed with John Brown at Harper's Ferry in 1859. But there in Oberlin, she married C.H. Langston, her second husband. And these then were the grandparents of Langston Hughes. I put this in because at in the 1880s, C.H. Langston had a grocery store in this building on Massachusetts Street in Lawrence that many of you probably have been by and know well. It's 820 Mass, and it was a grocery store owned or co-owned by Charles Langston. Here is Mary Patterson Leary Langston, the grandmother of Langston Hughes, and the woman that he came to live with very early in life. I have just recently found the census of, if I can switch to the Zoom. Oh, thank you. I was looking for something else, and that often happens to researchers. And in this 1905 census, if you look very closely, the census writer was not the greatest penman, but you will see Langston Mary, age 69. The M is for mulatto. And then in her household, Hughes Langston, 4. So Langston was here very, very early. He was born in Joplin, as Professor Schultz told you, but his parents were separated very, very soon in his babyhood, and Carrie, as a single mother, had a very, very difficult time, and she often brought Langston to Lawrence, and he literally grew up here, except for 1 year when she was able to take him to Topeka when she found a job. Okay, let's go on with the slides. Here is Carrie, or Caroline was her name, Carolyn Langston. and the young, very young Langston Hughes. I think it's a very lovely photograph. And as I said, very, very early, she just kind of would bring Langston here to Lawrence. This is James Hughes, Langston's father, and temperamentally, Langston and his father were, I would say, very, very opposite. James Hughes was an engineer, a practical man. He had a very difficult time with the increasing racism of this particular period right after the turn of the century. He couldn't find employment. He went to Mexico and did quite well there financially. But Langston Hughes seems to me to be much more temperamentally like his mother, who was interested in theater and much more of the artistic life that kind of sadly she really never got to express in her own life. Here is the little house at 736 Alabama that looks like Mary Langston's house. I remember Mary Langston's house quite well, and then I went by one time and it was gone. But the two little houses were right by each other on Alabama Street. And I knew Mrs. Walker, who lived in this house, and she described Carrie and so forth. So this is the neighborhood on Alabama Street in the 700 block. And interestingly enough, it was very mixed racially, white and black. And so Langston Hughes literally grew up in a very integrated neighborhood here in Lawrence. Here is Sherman Harvey. The Harvey family, a very prominent and highly successful family. The parents had come here during the Civil War with the liberation of the slaves in Arkansas, and their three sons all became early graduates of the University of Kansas. The reason I'm showing you Sherman here is that he became the county clerk, and he employed Caroline or Carrie Langston, who was Langston Hughes' mother later. But Carrie did go to school. She was actually born out at Lakeview, where her father was farming at that point. And she worked for a while. She took a course or two at KU, but did not go very long, and certainly did not graduate. Well, always when I think of Langston growing up there on Alabama and then later living on New York Street, he was always very near the river. And the bridge, he would have known the river very, very well from his earliest boyhood. Professor Schultz mentioned the peculiar situation in Kansas as far as school segregation. First-class cities under the laws of Kansas after a time were allowed to conduct separate classrooms. But first class meant that you were over 10,000. And Langston Hughes in second grade entered Pinckney School. It was interesting. Kansas, it's very difficult to make any broad general statement about school segregation in Kansas because it depended on the time and the place. Within Pinckney School, the first 3 grades were separated by race. And you see here, this Langston could be in this. I am not at all certain even of the year. But we are certain that the grades at that point, in fact, I talked to a woman who well remembered the separate classes within Pinckney School. This is the original Pinckney School. It was one of the earliest Lawrence schools on the same location that the current Pinckney School on 6th Street is now located. The school now is 1931, replacing this 1869. And this is the school that Langston Hughes went to from second, third. In 4th grade, he went to a different school. But before we get to that, this is his teacher, Mary Dillard, who taught all 3 of the primary grades of the black children within Pinckney School. Now, this is a later photograph when she was principal of Lincoln School out in North Lawrence, an all-black school that was still operating in 1954 at the time of Brown. But Mary Dillard was a very well-educated woman. She had graduated from KU and even taken graduate work, very talented, and Langston Hughes did maintain correspondence with her and likely stayed at her house when he came back to KU. This is the home that still stands at 520 Louisiana Street in the Pinckney neighborhood, and it's a lovely home built by her father, Jess Dillard, who had been born in slavery. And when he and Fanny, her parents, were married, he signed with an X. Now, whether he had the opportunity later to become literate, I don't know. He did have a number of pretty good jobs, but obviously an enormously talented man that built this house with his own hands. This is the building that I think was critical to Langston Hughes. He says in his autobiographies, and he wrote 2 of them, that it was in Lawrence that books happened to him. He was very lonely, as Professor Schultz has told you. And you saw the age difference. Mary Langston was 69, and Langston was either 3 or 4. So she was very much up in years and had raised a family by the time she had this young child. And this now is the Lawrence Art Center at 9th and Vermont. I'm sure all of you are familiar with it. But as far as I have been able to research with the rules and regulations in 1911 and with the operation of this building, which, by the way, was new in 1904, a Carnegie gift to the city, that is the one institution that had no racial restrictions. As far as, I think if they had had any restrictions, it would have been written down in those rules, because nobody else was hesitant about putting it down. So we think that he freely used the resources. Since Mary Langston had very little money, I assume that he spent a great deal of time, and of course easily could have walked from Alabama to the Art Center. So when I go in there, and recently at the Book Awards, I always feel the spirit of Langston Hughes. This is New York School. Mary Langston was so poverty-stricken that at various times she would simply rent out the little house on Alabama Street to save or to have some income, because, as Langston pointed out, Mary Langston, not like other black women that became domestics, and that goes back to the novel, she never worked outside or worked for other people. She was very proud in that sense. But she would just abandon her house and move in with her friends, the Reeds, on New York Street. And so in 4th grade, Langston went to New York School, and this is the old New York School on the 900 block of New York. The one that is there now is also a 1930s building. And I talked to a number of people who were classmates of Langston when I was researching this in the 1970s. I think they're all gone now. But I was always so amused at Mrs. McClanahan, a delightful, wonderful lady. And she was so tired of us asking her about Langston. And, you know, who can remember when they were in 4th grade? But Mrs. McClanahan said, If I'd known he was going to be so famous, I would have remembered more. But it had been so many years by the time that we talked to him. But who I did know was Langston's wonderful friend John Taylor, and that was just such a privilege when I was working on the statue that is in the Watkins Museum, and also doing the poetry project. As I said, Carrie went to KU, and this is just a view of some of the university buildings about the time Langston was growing up here. And remember, Alabama Street is just down the hill, literally down the hill from the university. And he never went to KU as a student, but he claimed in one of his autobiographies that they would slip into the science building and try to find the cadavers. And he misremembered Rock Chalk Jayhawk. What did he say? I should look that up. But when he was quoting it, it was not Rock Chalk Jayhawk. He misremembered it a little bit. Let's pull this down. One of the incidents in his boyhood, you will not be familiar with these two gentlemen, but if you lived around the turn of the century, you would probably have known both of them. This is Brett Williams and George Walker, who were extremely successful vaudevillians. George, nicknamed Nash Walker, was born here in Lawrence and was a contemporary of Carrie Langston, Langston's mother. And they became very, very well known, invented the cakewalk, I believe, and were very popular in New York. And during that time, it was such a time of incredibly increased racial epithets and so forth. They called themselves the Two Black Coons. But they were highly successful. And what Carrie remembers, Langston remembered his mother telling about eating dinner with Nash Walker off of gold leafed plates. Nash Walker died in 1911, and there was an enormous funeral here at the, now we call it the 9th Street Baptist Church. It was the Warren Street in that time before the street names were changed to numbers. And Langston was a little boy, I think he was about 8, and he went to the funeral, and the flowers were just overwhelming. He remembered the perfume of the flowers, and he was pointing to the flowers, and he got his hand slapped because children were not supposed to point. But that was one of the incidents that he remembered very much. And it seems to me that maybe his mother, saw the great success of her contemporary, Nash Walker, but she herself was limited quite literally to church pageants. This is the house that still stands here in Lawrence at 401 Indiana that Nash Walker built for his mother. It's in the Pinckney neighborhood. He did quite well, but did come home to be buried. Okay, let's see. We're let me see, why am I not getting the next slide here? There we are. There is Carrie, or Caroline Langston, after she remarried. She divorced James Hughes, and at some point she married Homer Clark. But we don't know exactly when this photograph, but you can see that Langston is becoming quite grown up, and it looks like a rather happy time. We think that maybe it's on Alabama, and it could have been at one of the various times that Carrie would come back. But you can see that he is growing up. And it was on living with the Reeds on New York Street that he was introduced to a different black family, and we think that it was a very critical part of his growing up here. His mother, of course, interested in theater and so forth, and this is a photograph of a Lawrence theater. And Carrie was very dramatic, apparently, in all of her life, even though she had to earn a living at one point, or quite a number of years, as a waitress and other rather menial kind of jobs, I guess you could say. Here is the woodland park that was developed by the electrical company and the electric rail line, and it was at about 13th Street on the east side of town. And this is the park that the, quote, colored children were not welcome at the all-day party. And I have the article from the newspaper saying this is a social occasion, and everyone knows that the colored children would not want to go. So that did happen in 1910. Langston would have been about 8. This is the Daisy Dozer at the park. It was extensive. Another incident during his boyhood was in 1911, this tremendous tornado that devastated the 600 block of Massachusetts. Must have made a tremendous impression on this young fella, particularly the next slide. Oh, that's still Mass. Let me go back. I believe, I'm not sure if that's Massachusetts or not. Well, the paper mill, yes, this is the industrial area. The tornado came right down the 600 block of Mass and then cut into Old West Lawrence and damaged a home quite near Mary Langston's home. So I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. So obviously, this would have made a tremendous impression on this young boy growing up here, the tornado, as well as these other incidences that it seems to me were later woven into the novel, not without laughter. On Illinois Street, near Mary Langston's home, a woman was killed, so no doubt that made a tremendous impression on the young Langston. Langston, as early as 12, got a job selling seeds. It must have been the Bartheldy Seed Company. You know the building as Sunflower Surplus. He just says in his autobiography that he got a job selling seeds. And of course, he was expected to bring in some income. Mary Langston Charles Langston had left a lot of debt and no money, and she did not work out of the home, so they had very little. This is the school, part of which still stands at 9th in Kentucky, but the first 2 stories, I believe it was fire damage, but that was Central School. It's now 901 Kentucky, and it was there that Langston was in junior high, and John Taylor remembers it well and told me this story, and I absolutely am convinced that it happened. This is the teacher of that 7th grade class there in Central. It's a Miss Ida Lyons, and this is the incident where, according to John Taylor, and certainly Langston Hughes believed it, that all of the black or African American students were moved into one row. Langston Hughes did not take that lying down and wrote Jim Crow Row on little slips of paper and threw them out the window. Well, it was, of course, got them into a heap of trouble. and called the principal and so forth, and they were dismissed from school. And John Taylor told me that they had to get Dr. Harvey, one of those well-educated Harvey men who was a very prominent African-American physician, and the brother of Sherman Harvey that Carrie had worked for. He had to come and vouch for the boys in order to get them readmitted to school. Now, when one of Bill Tuttle's students interviewed Ida Lyons, she did not remember it that way. But I tend to believe John Taylor, who told me with his own lips. He also, Langston Hughes that is, also got a job cleaning in a hotel, Spittoons. He did not say which hotel. I tend to believe it was this one that has now burned down. It was on Vermont Street near the, in the 800 block. And the reason I think that this is the one he was employed at, it was black owned, as were many businesses along Vermont there. He would have known the courthouse should he come in and revisit us. It was built in 1903. He would recognize it. He would recognize the Masonic Temple in 1911. Did I skip ahead? Let me back up a minute here. Slides? Oh. He would certainly recognize the 805 Ohio. It was the Simmons Hospital, and he would have passed it going to downtown. He would certainly have recognized what was then the post office, a brand new building in 1904. So there are many landmark buildings that Langston would feel that he still knew Lawrence. Well, Mary Langston died early in 1915, before the great gathering of the 50th anniversary of the survivors of Quantrill's raid. But Langston was still here, living with the Reed family. Carrie could not take him, so in his junior high years, he had moved back over with Uncle and Auntie Reed, who I think had a tremendous influence on him. And it was there with Auntie Reed that he went to St. Luke's Church and really heard the rhythms of the black church that were so influential. Mary Patterson Leary Langston died in 1915. And Charles Langston had died, I should have pointed out, long before Langston was born. They were both buried in a sort of potter's field at Oak Hill Cemetery. Their graves were not marked until 1991, when children at Pinckney School persuaded Rumsey Funeral Home to make markers available, and I consulted with them to get the dates and so forth. So for 50, 60 years they had laid in unmarked graves, but you can go out now and see them. Langston Hughes did come back to KU at least 3 times. He came back in 1932. He supported himself, you know, by giving readings around the country. This is in 1958, and he shouldn't have been smoking that cigarette, I don't think. And this is in 1965, and I think it's at Mary Dillard's house because he often visited her. Well, as Beth mentioned, we have finally gotten around to honoring Langston, and here is the plaque on City Hall. And now I think we will continue to have a presence. I'll just try to show you at the very end here. The Langston Hughes Creative Writing Award that I just attended at the Lawrence Art Center. It was sponsored by the Art Center and by the Raven Bookstore, and each year it will give awards to creative writers, but called the Langston Hughes Award. So maybe Beth Schultz will come up, and that's the end of my slides, and maybe we can talk about Langston Lawrence. Hope you'll have some questions about it. So, Beth, do you feel after seeing all those that it's there in the novel?
It certainly is.
It seems to me it is.
And I really do feel convinced that Hughes's vision, as Arnold acknowledges, had its seeds in his experiences here, even though so many other things influenced him. Having left Lawrence in 1916 and not writing the novel, or beginning to write it until 1927, that 11 years passed and a number of critical things happened to him, including his travels to Africa and to Europe, which were very important, as well as his travels to the South. And he certainly developed a lot of important relationships. But I think that growing up in Lawrence, growing up in our Midwestern community, he really had an opportunity to experience that in-betweenness, that sense of things not being absolutely good but not absolutely bad either, which is to say, I think he came to see and to believe in possibilities as a result of his boyhood in Lawrence.
I agree with that naturally, with that very much, and I think it's highly appropriate that we now, as you pointed out, are rather institutionalizing so that people will be aware. I did a little walking tour of Langston Hughes Lawrence, and it's on the Lawrence web page, so maybe people will recognize that.
Yes.
I was curious about what it was he did at the Lawrence Art Center as far as gathering resources. Was he there primarily for
It was
art?
a library. It was the Carnegie Library. I'm glad you asked that because I want to make that perfectly clear. It did not become an art center till 1975. That was the gift to the city of Andrew Carnegie, and it was the library, and that's where he says in his autobiography that it was in Lawrence that books happened to him, and that's the place he could go freely and get books without cost, and there was very, very little money in that family, so it was a library.
And we know in the novel that books were very important to him. I think stories were important. Certainly, the stories that Aunt Hager and Sister Johnson told Sandy were very important to him. But then, after he went to live with his Aunt Tempe, and he had access to the books in her library as well as the books in the shop where he was working, he began, as well as in his English class, he begins to understand that reading is important too. And so I think this is another way in which Hughes's manifestation of himself, the boy Sandy, brings together this kind of learning from the community, from the stories of the community, from the memories of the older people in the community. He brings those together with these books that were written by European Americans and by French people and by Russians, and this is another way in which I think Hughes, the complexity of Hughes is that he brings together so many disparate elements in the creation of his vision. He brings together, as he says in one of his poems, Theme for English B, which some of you know, he brings together Bach and the blues. And I think that it isn't, when we were in our discussion previously, it's neither hate nor love, but it's both. It's neither good nor bad, but it's both. It's neither the farmland nor the city land, but it's both. And I think that it is, Hughes's vision is this vision that really is capacious, that brings together antitheses. And interestingly enough, it is the form of the blues, this music that is, whose lyrics are so tragic, but whose music is so vibrant and throbbing. It's the music of the blues that really does, I think, best express this vision and this, well, I want to say vision again, this vision of antitheses, and which I would say also is a vision of possibility.
Speaking of the community and so forth, as well as the Lawrence community that he certainly experienced here, he had an uncle in Kansas City whom he visited.
That's right.
A barber, and that was a very influential.
Yes, it was.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, it was. And I think Kansas City was very important
Right.
to him. And when
I
his
think
mother
so,
would
too.
come back to visit her mother, she would then take him into Kansas City to visit his uncle. And you know that in the novel there are the sections that deal with the barbershop and with the pool hall, which deal with male culture, really. And I think it was primarily through his Kansas City uncle, as well as possibly Uncle Reed, that he began to appreciate that the kinds of stories that men told were different from the stories that Aunt Hager or his own grandmother, Mary Langston, would tell. But that's another way in which I think Hughes is capacious. He brings together the lives of men and women, both. And he himself, after all, having grown up in Sandy, grows up in a household that is dominated by women. His grandmother and his 3 aunts. And yet, as the boy Sandy grows up, it's very important to him that he go to work at the barbershop and then leave the barbershop to go to work at the hotel and then leave the hotel to go to, he goes through these various jobs. But he goes increasingly into a male-dominated culture. But again, I think those different gender roles are very much a part of his ultimate vision as well.
Is there anything you would like to bring up?
Or do you have any questions?
Yes.
Anything that's really was problematic to you about the novel, or seems peculiar about Hughes's life? Yes, sir.
Yes, I have a question. You mentioned his other autobiography, The Big C, and I was wondering if that was more non-fictional, if it included some of his childhood, or what that dealt with.
There are 2 autobiographies, The Big C and I Wonder As I Wander. And The Big C really brings his story up to the mid-20s, when he literally does head out. He ships out as an able-bodied seaman for Africa on a freighter. And the first thing he does, according to the autobiography, is to dump all his books into the ocean and decide that he's going to return to living on the pulses, really on the basis of his experiences. And then the second autobiography, which is published in the 40s, largely deals with his travels. And Hughes traveled all over the world. He spent a good deal of time in the Soviet Union. He was very impressed by communism. He himself, I don't think he actually became a member of the Communist Party, but he certainly knew people who were, and he was very interested in the socialist experiment. Very conscious of the ways in which democracy had not served his people, African Americans, had really betrayed the ideals of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And he wrote a good deal of quite radical verse, which ultimately led to his being brought before the House on Un-American Activities Committee, and he was profoundly humiliated by that experience. But he also traveled to China, traveled to India. He lived primarily in Harlem, but he also lived at various times in his life in various parts of the United States. Lived in
California.
California for a period of time. So he knew this country well, too. And I wonder, really deals with his travels. And again, I keep using this word, his sense of, a kind of global view as well. His recognition that people lived in different ways in different cultures according to different theological beliefs
And
all over the world.
Beth, I have the feeling today this is so accepted that it's hard to realize what an incredible innovation for Langston Hughes to do this. I love one of his comments about communism. He certainly was a fellow traveler, or what would be called him, but he said he never became a communist because they didn't like the blues or jazz. It's a little too decadent.
Yeah.
I'm curious, do you think that we're reading Not Without Laughter because it has pertinence to Lawrence, or is it truly one of his greatest works?
Well, obviously, you in a class which is focused on Lawrence are reading it because of its representation of the particular situation of a young African-American boy coming of age in the early part of the century. And I think that the novel does reveal a good deal about the particular dilemmas that a young black boy would have, attempting to grow up, attempting to achieve a sense of self, attempting to struggling for an identity. But it's very difficult to separate Hughes's boyhood experience from the man that he became, from the artist that he became. So to answer your question, yes, you're reading it, I think, because of what it has to say about life for African Americans at the beginning of this century. And you could also generalize and say life for an African American in a Midwestern town as opposed to a Southern town or a Northern town. But I think, I would hope that having perhaps been introduced to Langston Hughes through the novel, if you haven't met him in another poem or another story or an essay, I hope you will rush right out and get one of his collections of poems. And so, yes, I would like to say that Not Without Laughter is one of his significant writings. I think probably Hughes is better known for his poetry than he is for his fiction. This is the only novel he wrote. As I said, he wrote over 35 books, and the majority of those are collections of poetry. If you look at that biography that I passed out, you will see that many more of the works that I've noted are collections of poetry. He did write, in terms of his prose writing, he did write another collection of short stories, and then his simple stories, which were published in the Chicago Defender in the 50s, they're essays focusing on this character whose name was Just Be Simple. Got it? This Simple is the epitome of the streetwise character, the street smart character, and they are fabulous. They are so funny, but painfully funny. They are not without laughter. In his simple stories, he takes on every issue imaginable that African Americans would have been concerned with in the 50s, including the United Nations. So yes, I think this is a splendid representation of Hughes's works, but certainly it's important for this class because of what it says regarding a young black boy's coming of age in a town that is modeled on Hughes's own experiences in Lawrence.
What about Hughes and his sexuality and how that may have been inseparable from his Lawrence experience?
Well, Hughes's sexuality remains enigmatic, but we know that he never married, that probably he never had a live-in partner. What I think Not Without Laughter really suggests to us is that Hughes was perhaps interested in both men and women. He was certainly conscious of the attractions of Pansetta, but we know that his shyness perhaps kept him from making the move, and his old buddy Jimmy Lane got there first. We also know, and I think that this is an interesting part of the description of his days in Chicago, that one of the encounters that he had, indeed the first encounter that he had on the street after he left the apartment that his mother had arranged for him, was with a gay man, and the young Sandy was very uncomfortable by that encounter. But what's remarkable about the description of the encounter with the gay man, it seems to me, is that it's there at all. And my sense is that probably Hughes was bisexual. This is a word that he probably wouldn't have used. I don't think it had currency in his, I don't know, in his lifetime. I don't know when it actually came into our discourse. But I think that, once again, this is Hughes, who is not, in terms of his sexuality, you don't feel in reading, or at least I don't feel in reading Not Without Laughter, that he's settled. He's not Jimmy Lane. And he's not Willie May. Willie May, we know, is getting married by the end of the novel, and Jimmy Lane is clearly making it with a lot of young women. And Sandy is on the cusp. Sandy is looking around, and he's sensitive to the approach from this gay man, even as he's thinking about the elderly people back in Stanton. In other words, I think that what the 16-year-old Sandy at the end of this novel is sexually open, as he is open to every other kind of human experience. What would you say?
I wonder about growing up among women and whether or not that made him much more open to a lot of things.
Yeah.
If he was shy and more sensitive, and I mean, granted, his aunt, his grandmother was tough, but he must have had
It isn't only that he grew up among women, but he grew up among such different women.
Mm-hmm.
He never knew, or the Sandy of the novel, and Hughes too, never knew his grandfather.
Or his father very well.
Well, Jim Boy, though, in the novel has a very, I think, important place in his life. But, although Jim Boy is important to Sandy, but James
Hughes, he had 1 year or one summer
in
Mexico. It was very unsatisfactory. But his relationship with Carrie was fraught with
anxiety. Yes, it was. But I think that he he certainly was, Sandy that is, was surrounded by diverse women who were all themselves sexually with different kinds of people. There was his mother who doted on her husband, his Aunt Harriet, who became a prostitute and the Princess of the Blues, who obviously was having affairs with diverse men from the time she was very young. And in taking Sandy to that dance, Sandy saw diverse kinds of sexual, well, was literally, when we see that kid up there in the balcony looking down on the dancers, he saw surely everything going on. So I think he was making sense out of it. My sense about regarding Sandy is that for much of the novel he is an observer. He's taking it all in and formulating questions, based on what he observes.
Perhaps
And that's the basis for becoming an artist, right?
you said it's enigmatic. For a man who's written 2 autobiographies, if it's still enigmatic, maybe it's not an issue of very much
The
significance
truth of
to
the matter
him.
is, there's nothing mentioned in either autobiography about his relationships.
And Arnold Rampus had never found any man that claimed to have had a relationship.
Right.
And at one point he did live, I think for practical reasons, with a ballerina in Paris, but it was a short life. One practical thing I might say, he supported himself with his writing, which was a very difficult thing to do. And it wasn't until the very end of his life, I think, that he had much in the way of financial rewards.
Yes, sir.
There was an issue of the sexuality with the black community in Los Angeles because they complained about a display at the Los Angeles Public Library that mentioned his sexuality. And it was a censorship issue with the black community there.
You mean recently?
Within the last, I'd say, 2 or 3 years, I know there's something written up in American libraries about it.
I'm unaware of that.
If you have access to that article, I sure would like to see it.
No, it would be accessible at the Watson Library also.
Watson? But it was the,
I'm-
what institution in L.A. Was
I'm pretty sure it was the LA Public Library.
Uh-huh.
There was a censorship issue with a display that the library had.
I see.
Interesting.
Huh.
Langston still can raise issues.
Yeah. Any other questions from you all?
Well,
Okay.
it was fun to hear you, and I'm sure that we could delve into all kinds of sub-issues here. Our time is out.
Thank you.